The days are getting short, and the nights grow long, dark, and cold. It's Christmas season, and the perfect time for classic ghost stories. Yes, Christmas time is the traditional time for retelling of classic ghost stories. And when I mention that fact, especially here in the States, I usually get two questions. The first being, why? And that is a really good question, but it's not the topic of today's video. The next question is invariably, well, what are some good Christmas ghost stories? And that is the topic of today's video, but it's also a bit of a minefield. You see, that's kind of like offering somebody this fossilized bowl of Christmas candy. Some of them are actually quite good. Others not so much. And I can only tell you from my experience that the red ones could be cherry or cinnamon or possibly strawberry, or the green ones could be lime or mint, or the yellow one could be lemon, which I really love. But it could also be, let's just say I have an almost irrational fear of selecting one that is intended to taste like banana. But that's just my point. Some people may really, really enjoy that disgusting flavor. So the big point being that you'll never really know whether you like it until you try it. All I can do is give you my recommendations based on my own experience and taste. That's one of the reasons I'm not so interested in coming up with top 10 lists or ranking of any kind. I've decided instead to create a list of basically a variety of flavors of Christmas ghost stories. Everything from the truly terrifying to the humorous and everything in between. Hopefully, you'll connect with one or two of them. So, without further ado, one more thing. Criteria. It can't just be a wintertime story. It needs to be narrowed down just a tiny bit. So the story must make direct reference to Christmas by name and or take place during the Christmas season. And since Christmas season can be defined in different ways, we're not talking about the entire 40 days of the traditional liturgical Christmas season, but limited to, say, Christmas Eve to the first 3 or 4 days of the new year. And now, without further ado, selected classic ghost stories for Christmas. Now, I know this will probably be considered low-hanging fruit for many of you, but I feel that I would be remiss if I was to skip over these first two stories. Even though we'll be mostly concentrating on short ghost stories, the kind that you can read in a single sitting. The first couple here are a bit longer. And the first one, of course, should be of no surprise to anybody. The elephant in the room, so to speak. A ghost story so popular and so well known, not to mention such a large part of our Western culture, that most everyone in the English-speaking world is at least somewhat familiar with it. And so familiar with it, in fact, that most people have forgotten that it's actually a ghost story, which it most certainly is. I am speaking, of course, of A Christmas Carol by English author Charles Dickens. A Christmas Carol, or more appropriately, A Christmas Carol in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. There are, of course, an enormous number of adaptations of this story. I can't even begin to recollect them all. I can say that my personal favorite is the 1984 film version starring George C. Scott, mostly because I feel that it strays less from the source material than just about any other version I'm familiar with. I'm also very fond of the Alastair Sim version from the 1950s, but there are many that I really enjoy. Regardless of what your favorite adaptation is, I still highly, highly recommend that you actually read the story. You won't be disappointed. Next up is also another longish story, this time from American author Henry James. The story is, of course, The Turn of the Screw. One of the most highly respected literary ghost stories, The Turn of the Screw's ambiguity is allowed for many interpretations over the years, but it remains at heart a Gothic ghost story told on Christmas Eve around a fire. Whether you believe the ghost to be real or imagined, it's still an effective and highly atmospheric ghost story that is certainly worth the read. The remainder of the stories on my list are more typical short ghost stories, perfect for a quick Christmas Eve read. I've mentioned our next story on this channel before, one of my favorite short Christmas tales by English author A.M. Burrage. It's called Smee. A young man attending a Christmas party relates a story about a previous Christmas party he took part in, and the horrifying experience he had that prevents him from ever playing hide and seek again. A great little, somewhat creepy story, but make sure that you read the actual story as written by Burrage and not the heavily revised editions that are floating around on the internet these days. Moving on from mildly creepy to a bit more gruesome, we have The Kit Bag by English author Algernon Blackwood. A young law clerk is preparing for a much-deserved Christmas holiday after the completion of a horrific murder case. Having borrowed a bit of luggage from his superior, he's shocked to see that the bag is filthy and has some very disconcerting stains on it. Even worse, he finds that when glanced at from a certain angle, the bag bears an uncanny resemblance to a human face. As you can probably tell, I would not recommend this one for young children. But if you're in the mood for something a tad more frightening, this should suit nicely. If you enjoy the gruesome but want a bit of humor sprinkled in, I would highly recommend this next story by English author Marjorie Bowen, The Crown Derby Plate. It tells the story of Martha Pym, a London antique store manager that is taking her Christmas holiday in the English countryside. For 30 years, Martha's been missing a plate from a set of china she bought in an auction sale at a nearby estate. Being in town for the holiday, she's determined to find the new owner and see if the estate can locate the missing piece for her. Fortunately, the owner is at home. Or is she? And what is that horrible smell? Marjorie Bowen also wrote a number of other Christmas ghost stories. A couple that I would recommend would be The Breakdown, a Christmas Eve ghost story with a touch of romance thrown in, for those who prefer something a bit on the lighter side. It's not a frightening tale, but it's rather sweet in its own way. And Raw Material, another bit of humor in this one. This time, someone is looking for the raw material for a Christmas ghost story. And this is presented by a lawyer that was involved with a case where a wealthy old woman was poisoned to death by her relatives. She comes back to haunt them, of course, but not in the way that anyone would have expected. This next story recommendation is for those looking for something a little more obscure. This story is called Catherine's Quest. The author is unknown, but it's often misattributed to the famous Irish ghost story writer Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, mostly due to it being included in the ghost story anthology A Stable for Nightmares, which included a story by Le Fanu. The majority of the authors of this anthology are, in fact, uncredited, but Le Fanu's name is on the cover of most editions, and many readers aren't aware that it is not a collection of his stories. As for the story itself, it is a rather traditional ghost story that centers around a Christmas gathering where a house guest falls ill on New Year's Eve and has visions of a gruesome incident from the past that will have a profound effect on her own future. Our next recommendation is from the inimitable British master of the short story, Hector Hugh Munro, better known as Saki. The Wolves of Cernogratz. It tells of the legend surrounding the Cernogratz family. It's said that if a Cernogratz is to die in their ancestral home, the wolves will gather and serenade the dying. Of course, the Cernogratz family is extinct, and the pompous current residents of the castle think the legend is nothing but an old wives' tale. However, they must reconsider this stance when one cold, dark New Year's Eve, Amelie, their dowdy old governess, becomes deathly ill. As is usual for a Saki story, this can be scary, it can be mysterious, or it can be downright hilarious, depending on your point of view. Our next tale is from the famous English author Edith Nesbit. You may know of her from her children's books, including the extremely popular title The Railway Children. She was, however, a very accomplished teller of ghost stories. And I should warn you that this ghost story is not particularly child-friendly. Not that it's overly gruesome or violent or even exceptionally frightening. It is, however, a tale of regret, lost love, dreams deferred. In other words, adult matters. And they probably wouldn't interest most kids. It is also, much like The Turn of the Screw, filled with ambiguities and open to many interpretations. The tale in question is The Portent of the Shadow, or sometimes simply referred to as The Shadow. It takes place during a Christmas dance at a big country manor house, where all the guests are spending the night. A group of young ladies invite the old housekeeper to warm herself by the fire and, of course, tell a ghost story. For those of you that are more interested in mood and atmosphere than outright scares, our next story should be just your cup of tea. From the English novelist Mary Elizabeth Braddon, we have At Crichton Abbey. Crichton family comes from far and wide for a large Christmas gathering, and also to meet Miss Tremaine, fiancée of Crichton heir apparent Edward. Although most of the Crichtons do not particularly like Miss Tremaine, Edward's mother is greatly relieved at his upcoming marriage, since the unmarried heirs of Crichton have an uncanny tendency towards meeting an untimely end. Although this is a ghost story, it is more of a period piece, in my opinion. If you enjoy works such as Brideshead Revisited, Gosford Park, Downton Abbey, the atmosphere should feel familiar to you. Up next, easily the oldest of the stories in my list, this next tale is actually an adaptation from a portion of the Icelandic Grettis saga that took most of its current form in the 13th century, although the story itself is probably much, much older. This adaptation comes from the English author, scholar, and Anglican priest, Sabin Baring Gould. He titled his version Glaumer, after the story's antagonist, a pagan shepherd that refuses to participate in Christian customs or rites, even on Christmas Eve. While everyone else is attending Christmas Mass, Glaumer goes out into the dark, cold, and stormy night to tend his flock. He's never seen alive again. I say alive because he is unfortunately seen again as a draugr, an undead creature of great evil that haunts the living. Returning to a more lighthearted vein, we have one of the funniest ghost stories that I know of, and one that is perfectly suitable to all audiences. As a matter of fact, this is probably the first ghost story that I ever read, having picked it up in my grade school library. That said, it's just as funny for adults as it is for kids. From American author John Kendrick Bangs, The Water Ghost of Harrowby Hall. Every Christmas at midnight for one whole hour, the owner of Harrowby Hall is haunted by the spirit of a long-departed relative that soaks everything around her with seawater. As it is impossible to sell off the property since the ghost makes itself known to any intended buyer, the hall remains in the Oglethorpe family for many generations, the current heir being harassed and drenched for an hour, even if he isn't in the hall, but wherever in the world he may be. That is, until the ghost's great-great-great-great-great-great-nephew devises a plan to stop her hauntings for good. Next up is another classic Gothic tale, this one from the English author and biographer Elizabeth Gaskell, The Old Nurse's Story. The old nurse of the title is Hester, who relates a story to her current charges of her own youth when she was made responsible for raising their mother, Rosamond, after the child was suddenly orphaned. Rosamond's uncle sends them to live with his great-aunt in the lonely and decaying yet still grand family home, Furnival Manor. Here they find the aunt, Miss Grace Furnivall, to be an old woman that is literally haunted by the sins of her past. Unfortunately, these phantoms pose a danger to all of the residents of the old house, especially in the wintertime. If this story has a familiar feel, it should be noted that Elizabeth Gaskell was a close friend of the Bronte family, as well as the biographer of Charlotte Bronte. If you're a fan of Gothic tales in the vein of Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, you should certainly enjoy this one. I know that I previously mentioned that I didn't want to rank any of these stories, but I did kind of want to save one of my favorites for last. So far I've tried to include stories that range from frightening to humorous, gruesome, romantic, even emotionally touching. Some rare stories manage to cram all these elements together, but they tend to be fairly long, such as A Christmas Carol. But to get all of those bits crammed into a short story without creating an uneven mess is an enormous balancing act. And I feel that somehow E.F. Benson pulled it off with this next story, How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery. Unlike most ghost stories that culminate in a skeptic having to accept the inexplicable, this story disposes with skepticism entirely. The Peveril family has long ago accepted the many ghosts of their ancestors that haunt their home, and they even look forward to their appearances. There is an exception, however, or more properly, two: the twins. But there is one ghost at Church Peveril at which the family never laugh, in which they feel no friendly and amused interest, and of which they only speak just as much as necessary for the safety of their guests. More properly, it should be described as two ghosts, for the haunt in question is that of two very young children who were twins. These, not without reason, the family take very seriously indeed. Their appearance, luckily for those who inhabit the house, was exceedingly rare. On each occasion they appeared at night, between sunset and sunrise, always in the same long gallery, and always as two toddling children scarcely able to walk. And on each occasion the luckless individual who saw them died either speedily or terribly, or with both speed and terror, after the accursed vision had appeared to him. Sometimes he might live for a few months. He was lucky if he died. Visitors were warned not to go between sunset and sunrise into the long gallery. And for many, many years there had been no incident, due to the diligence of the current Peveril family in keeping their visits to the long gallery limited to daylight hours. That is, until one afternoon during the Christmas season, at the Peveril annual New Year's ball. One of the family hurt her knee while skating and decided to take a break in the long gallery, where she promptly fell asleep. Of course, there are many, many other classic Christmas ghost stories that are out there, and I'm sure I've only included a small fraction of them. However, I hope that at least a few of these stories will resonate with you. Please feel free to leave a comment and let me know which worked for you and which ones fell short. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the upcoming year. And from the Literate Ghost, wishes for a very, very Merry Christmas.